Salem, Massachusetts, April 7th, 1830. 6 o'clock in the morning. A manservant opened the kitchen shutters to let in the early light. He saw the back parlor window standing open. Below it, a plank had been propped up from the yard to the sill. Leaning against the house like a ladder, someone had forgotten to take away. He went to find the maidservant. Together, they walked through the rooms. The house belonged to Captain Joseph White, 82 years old, retired. The wealthiest man most of Salem had ever seen, and a man who, by every account left to us, had not a single enemy in the world. He lived here quietly, on Essex Street, on the same street he had walked his whole life. They reached his bedroom door. It was open, which was unusual. They moved toward the bed. The bedclothes had been turned down. The sheets were soaked through with blood. Captain White lay still, cold and stiff. Someone had planned this for months. Every contingency accounted for, every obstacle removed, all except the one they carried with them into every room they entered afterward. Captain White had not made his fortune in a quiet place. In 1830, Salem was one of the largest ports in the United States. Its merchant families had grown extraordinary fortunes, trading with the East Indies, the Mediterranean, the coast of Africa. Elias Haskett Derby, Salem's most famous son, had been America's first millionaire, and at his death in 1799, stood among the wealthiest people in human history. Captain Joseph White had built his own fortune in the same trade, on the same water, over the same decades. His house stood on Essex Street, Salem's principal thoroughfare, the street traversed at night. One newspaper noted, by persons living in or passing through the town. A fine federal-style house, the Gardner-Pingree House, people called it, and it still stands today. He never married. He had no children of his own. What he had was a household. His niece, Mrs. Mary Beckford, kept it for him, managing his rooms and his servants, living under his roof for years. His adopted son, Stephen, ran the active business. White himself had stepped back. He was 82 years old. He slept in a room whose windows faced the street. He had strong opinions about the people around him. When his grandniece, Mary Beckford, married a young man named Joseph Knapp against his wishes, in November of 1827, White disinherited her. He left her $15,000 in a revised will, a considerable sum to many people, but a fraction of an estate worth $200,000. He was not a man without complications. The diary of Reverend William Bentley, written in these same decades, records a vessel in White's employ participating in the African slave trade. A captain was killed by enslaved men aboard sometime in the 1790s. Salem's wealth had not been built without cost. White's had not been either. He was, nonetheless, the kind of man whose death stopped a city. Business nearly shut down the day they buried him. On the street corners, people gathered in clusters, catching the latest rumor, unable to understand how something like this had reached their quiet, prosperous town. 2 days before he died, on April 5th, Mrs. Beckford left for Wenham. Wenham was 7 miles from Salem, a short trip along roads White knew well. Mrs. Beckford's daughter lived there. Her daughter was Mary. The grandniece White had disinherited. Mary had married Joseph Knapp, Jr., and they kept a house in Wenham, and Mrs. Beckford had gone to spend a few days with them. She had kept Captain White's house for years. She had watched over his household, managed his rooms, made certain the doors were locked at night, and the servants had what they needed. She left on the 5th, and the house became an old man, 2 servants, and a window that was no longer latched. She had not chosen that window. She had not known about it. The visit to Wenham had been arranged. Not by her. The night of April 6th was clear. The moon was up. 2 men waited in the street, outside the Gardner-Pingree house. They had been there since around 10 o'clock, standing in the dark, watching the lights in the windows go out one by one, 300 feet from the back of the house, near enough to watch, far enough, they believed, to be safe. Richard Crowninshield was not a stranger to Salem. He was from Danvers, the next town over, from one of Essex County's most prominent families. He had also earned a reputation for violence that had been spreading through the county for years. Joseph Knapp, Jr. had hired him for $1,000, 20 silver dollar coins for every year of the old man's life, more or less. It was the kind of arithmetic that seemed reasonable to Joseph Knapp, Jr. in the spring of 1830. Crowninshield crossed the yard. He set the plank against the house, climbed to the unlatched window, and stepped inside. He moved through the back parlor, down the hall, half lit by moonlight coming through the windows, up the stairs. Later, Joseph Knapp, Jr. would write out what Crowninshield told him afterward. The confession would run to several pages, but this is the sentence that stays. The moon was shining through the window on to the old man's face. Captain White was asleep, 82 years old, in the bed he had slept in for decades, in the house on the street where he had lived his whole life. He did not wake. Crowninshield raised the bludgeon, a lead-weighted club, the kind a man could carry under a coat, and struck White on the left temple. The blow fractured the skull, a depression 3.5 inches across. Then he drew a long dagger and stabbed him 13 times in the chest, driving the blade toward the heart with each stroke. He lowered the bedclothes to make certain of his aim. He raised the aged arm and replaced it over the wounds. Then he felt for the pulse. Satisfied, he retraced his steps. Down the stairs, through the hall, out through the window, across the yard. He met Frank Knapp on a side street and told him what had been done. Before he left Salem for Danvers that night, he stopped at a meeting house on Howard Street and hid the bludgeon under the front steps. In Wenham, 7 miles away, Joseph Knapp, Jr. was home. The Salem Gazette printed its first account on April 9th. A murder, it announced, has been perpetrated so horrible and atrocious that we should in vain search the records of crime in any country for a case exceeding it in enormity. That was not understatement. It was the genuine bewilderment of a city that had believed itself exempt. Nothing had been stolen. A roll of gold doubloons sat undisturbed in the chamber. White had no enemies, no feuds, no history of conflict. The window had been unlatched from the inside, which meant someone with access to the house had done it, but nothing else made sense. The Salem Observer reported that the usual business of our citizens has been almost entirely suspended. On every corner of every street, people gathered, passing rumor to rumor, waiting for information that did not come. Salem organized itself quickly. A committee of vigilance, 27 men, was appointed within days to investigate the crime. They offered $1,000 reward. They also began searching houses. Without warrants, the Fourth Amendment had been in effect for 39 years. Nobody in Salem, in the spring of 1830, appeared to notice the tension. The committee's methods were called, in the press, a model of secrecy, prudence, and zeal. The city was grateful. Then the Knapp brothers came forward. On April 27th, 3 weeks after the murder, Joseph Knapp, Jr. and his brother John Francis appeared before the committee. They had been returning from Salem to Wenham. The previous evening, they said, when 3 robbers ambushed them near Wenham Pond. Seized the horse, grabbed a trunk, disappeared into the dark. The brothers had fought them off, more or less. A gang of assassins, working the roads between Salem and Wenham. That was the new theory. The committee noted it down. Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. was 23 years old in the spring of 1830. He was the husband of Mary Beckford. The grandniece White had cut out of the bulk of his estate. He had free access to the White House as a family member. He knew the household. He knew when Mrs. Beckford would be away. He had also spent the previous year studying inheritance law, or trying to. His theory: if Captain White died without a valid will, Mary stood to inherit half the entire estate, roughly $100,000. Massachusetts calculated descent through family branches, and Mary was the only child of White's sister. The sister's branch received half. Simple enough. What he had missed was a single exception buried in the statute. If all surviving heirs stood at the same degree of kinship to the deceased, they divided the estate equally regardless of branches. Mary and her 4 cousins were equally related to White. She would have received 1/5, about $40,000, not $100,000. He had built a murder on a misreading of a footnote. He had also, before he hired Crowninshield, gone into White's bedchamber under some household pretense, found what he believed was the current will, and stolen it. He burned it several days later. That will was not the most recent. White had written another after it. So the wrong will destroyed, the wrong inheritance calculated, and a man dead on the 7th of April. The robbery near Wenham Pond had not happened. The Knapp brothers had fabricated it to give the committee a different direction to look. It was the first document in a trail Joseph Knapp was building against himself. On May 12th, 5 weeks after the murder, a letter arrived at the home of Captain Joseph Knapp Sr. The senior Knapp was a prominent shipmaster and merchant, a respectable man who ran a respectable house. The letter came from a man who called himself Charles Grant, Jr., of Prospect, Maine, which is a small town in the coastal counties, about 70 miles northeast of Salem. Grant explained that he needed $350. He could offer no security. He needed the money promptly, and, he added, it would be very much to the recipient's advantage to comply, because he, Grant, was acquainted with Frank Knapp and also with the business Frank had been transacting on the 2nd of April. He thought $350 was generous, given that Joseph Knapp Jr. had apparently been willing to pay $1,000 for the work. I think that you was very extravagant, Grant wrote, in giving $1,000 to the person that would execute the business for you. Captain Knapp Sr. had no idea what any of this meant. He went to Wenham to show his son. Joseph Knapp Jr. read the letter. He called it a devilish lot of trash. He told his father to take it to the Vigilance Committee. His father did exactly that. Joseph Knapp Jr. had just handed the Vigilance Committee the first direct evidence that the murder had been commissioned, written by a man who knew the price, the date, the name of the broker. He had handed it to them himself, through his father, on his own advice. The Vigilance Committee dispatched an agent to Belfast, Maine, at once. The next morning, Joseph Knapp Jr. drove into Salem. He found a friend and asked him to mail 2 letters. He said his father had received an odd anonymous note, and he wanted to nip the silly affair in the bud. The friend asked no questions. The first letter was addressed to Gideon Barstow, chairman of the Vigilance Committee. It was signed Grant. It claimed that Stephen White, the captain's nephew and heir, and the man who had offered the $1,000 reward, had come to Grant one night and offered $5,000 to have the old man killed. Stephen White had opened the window himself. Stephen White had been present at the murder. Stephen White had not yet paid. The second letter was addressed to Stephen White. It was also signed Grant. It demanded the $5,000 with some urgency. Both letters would reach their recipients within days. Meanwhile, the committee's agent had arrived in Belfast. He had taken the postmaster into his confidence. He was waiting behind a counter when a man came in and asked for the mail held for Charles Grant, Jr. The man was arrested on the spot. His name was not Grant. His name was Palmer, a former convict from the town of Belfast, and an associate of the Crowninshield family, who had been present in their house when Frank Knapp had come to negotiate the murder of Captain White in early spring. Palmer, facing prosecution himself, told everything. The committee now had a full account of the conspiracy, and they had the 2 letters Joseph Knapp Jr. had tried to use to redirect them. Letters that turned out, when examined by people who knew the handwriting, to have been written in a hand that was not Palmer's, not Grant's, not any stranger's. Both letters were in Joseph Knapp Jr.'s hand, the ones meant to send the investigation towards Stephen White. the ones he had called nipping the silly affair in the bud. He had written his own indictment twice and had someone else mail it. The Knapps were arrested. On the third day of his imprisonment, Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. made a full written confession. He wrote out the entire plan from the beginning: the stolen will, Mrs. Beckford's arranged absence, how the window had been left unlatched, the negotiations with Crowninshield, and the $1,000 agreed upon. He described the night of April 6th, Frank and himself in the street, the lights going out one by one, Crowninshield going in over the plank. He named the meeting house on Howard Street and the steps where the bludgeon had been hidden. The officers went there and found it. Toward the end of the confession, he added something that read almost like an afterthought. The will he had stolen was not the current will. Captain White had made a newer one after it. The one he burned had already been superseded, and even if it hadn't been, his calculation about what Mary would inherit had been wrong from the start. He had caused a man's death for an inheritance that was never going to arrive. Richard Crowninshield received the news of Knapp's confession in his cell. He had maintained a posture of calm indifference since his arrest, steady, unrevealing, giving nothing. When he learned that Knapp had written it all down, the calm gave way. On June 15, 1830, he tied a handkerchief to the bars of his cell and hanged himself. He died before he could be tried, and here the law hit a wall. Under Massachusetts statute as it stood in 1830, accessories to a murder could not be convicted unless the actual murderer was first convicted and found guilty. Richard Crowninshield was the actual murderer. Richard Crowninshield was dead. The Knapp brothers, the men who had planned the crime, paid for it, and arranged every condition for its success, stood to walk free. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts turned to Daniel Webster. Webster was then among the most distinguished attorneys in the country, a senator, a former congressman, a man who had argued more than 200 cases before the United States Supreme Court. He was better known as a defense lawyer than a prosecutor. He rarely stood on the side of the Commonwealth. He accepted the case. He described the murder, in his first address to the jury, in terms that left no ambiguity about what he thought it was. It was a cool, calculating, money-making murder. It was all hire and salary, not revenge. It was the weighing of money against life, the counting out of so many pieces of silver against so many ounces of blood. His task, stripped to its legal core, was this: to argue that a man standing 300 feet from a murder, waiting in the street as a lookout, was present enough at that murder to be convicted as a principal rather than as an accessory. The distinction mattered because the accessory law was broken, but the principal law was not. This was not a settled question. The defense position at John Francis Knapp's trial was straightforward. The law required that an accessory be present during the commission of the felony. John Knapp had been standing on a public street, 300 feet from the bedroom where Captain White was being killed. He had not been in the house. He had not been in the room. Under the plain meaning of the word present, he had not been present. It was, as legal arguments go, not unreasonable. Webster's response became one of the foundational passages of Massachusetts criminal law. Presence, he argued, did not require proximity. It required only that the accomplice be in a position where he might render aid to the perpetrator, or where the perpetrator believed he might render aid. The point selected had been selected to provide assistance. Whether it was well or ill chosen for that purpose was immaterial. And then Webster turned to the bedroom. Deep sleep had fallen on the destined victim, he told the jury, and on all beneath his roof, a healthful old man to whom sleep was sweet. The first sound slumbers of the night held him in their soft but strong embrace. The assassin enters, through the window already prepared, into an unoccupied apartment. With noiseless foot, he paces the lonely hall, half lighted by the moon. He winds up the ascent of the stairs, and reaches the door of the chamber. The face of the innocent sleeper is turned from the murderer, and the beams of the moon, resting on the gray locks of his aged temple, show him where to strike. It was the only moment in the entire legal proceeding when anyone spoke about Captain White as a man. An old man in his bed, his face in the moonlight. The jury deliberated. They found John Francis Knapp guilty of murder. 4 months later, Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. stood trial. He refused, when called to the stand, to testify against his brother. It did not save him. He was convicted of murder. John Francis Knapp and Joseph Jenkins Knapp, Jr. were hanged from the same scaffold. The plan had been, take the will, erase the evidence, collect the inheritance through Mary. Joseph Knapp, Jr. had believed, in the winter of 1829 and 1830, that he had found an intelligent solution to a problem. An old man's inconvenient longevity was standing between his family and $200,000, and the solution could be hired, executed cleanly, and left behind. The will he burned turned out to be the wrong will. The amount he calculated turned out to be wrong. The letters he wrote to redirect the investigation were in his own hand, and the confession he gave on the third day, the one he later refused to repeat on the stand, had already been copied into the court record. Mrs. Mary Beckford, the woman whose house had been used as the staging ground, whose departure had been arranged as the operational precondition, who had come home on the morning of April 7th to a household she would never manage again, inherited $15,000, exactly what the current will had always specified. Salem remembered. Business had stopped for the funeral of Captain Joseph White. On corners across the city, people had gathered and talked and waited for answers. A man they had described as having no enemies had been killed in his sleep by a member of his own family for money that was never going to materialize on the basis of a legal theory that had been wrong from the start. The Committee of Vigilance, which had searched houses without warrants and been praised for its thoroughness, had been handed the key evidence by the killer himself. 13 years later, in Boston, a writer published a short story. A man kills an old man in his bed. The moonlight is on the old man's face. The killer feels for the pulse afterward to make sure, and then, for the rest of the story, for the rest of his life, he cannot escape the sound of what he has done. Edgar Allan Poe had read about Salem. He may have read Daniel Webster's account of a hired assassin checking the wrist of a dead man for a heartbeat that had already stopped. What he did with it, scholars have long debated. What is not debated, the Gardner Pingree House still stands on Essex Street in Salem. Captain Joseph White is buried not far from it. He was 82 years old, and he died in the city he had helped build, in the house where he had always lived, while the moon came through his window and lit his face for a man he had never met.